Have you ever tried to teach a tentative 5-year-old how to float on water if they don't know how to swim? I have, and it's easier said than done. They lay back in the water on your hands, and you remind them to keep his head back, not to have his chin pinned against his chest, and to keep his belly and his pelvis raised. And he might do this while you're holding your arms underneath him. But when you tell him you're going to move your arms, and you begin to slide your arms from underneath him, the head shoots up, the rear goes down, the arms begin to flail wildly, trying to keep the body above water. You grab him, and you both get wetter than you had hoped. In my experience, this is a good time to get out of the pool and get some snacks. In the gospel lesson this morning, Peter got wetter than he had hoped. Now, I don't know when he got back in the boat if he got a snack when it was all over, but we do know he got a reprimand. You know the story. Jesus is walking on the water, and he's coming to the disciples, and it must be close to Halloween because they think it's a ghost. So they become afraid, but Jesus reassures them, no, it's not a ghost, it's just me. And then Peter, of course, Peter gets an idea. I want to do that. That looks like fun. Peter wants to do it. So, Lord, if it's you, bid me to come out with you. And Jesus says, come. Now, Peter absolutely amazes me, mostly because he's so unlike me. He's like the anti-Roger. I mean, I've confessed to you before that I'm not a big fan of large bodies of water, partly because I'm from the Midwest, but also because I believe I have an appropriately biblical understanding of water. The deep is fearful. The deep is mystery. Water is scary. Water covered the earth and destroyed all life. Water is where a big fish swims that can swallow a prophet. Water is where the great sea monster Leviathan lives. Water is where the sharks swim. Water is scary. And so I have a deep awe and respect for people like Peter who can face their fears and take these kinds of risks. I mean, imagine that moment just for a second. Imagine that moment when a human being like us decides to put one foot over the edge of a boat, really believing that when his foot touches the water, it's not going to break through the surface, but the surface is going to support him. Imagine that moment. Well, that's all the longer that moment lasted, because fear robbed Peter of the moment. He saw the wind and he saw the waves, and his ancient reptile brain began to kick in, and his adrenal glands gave him a burst of adrenaline, and he felt fear, and he started to sink. So he cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus grabbed him, and then, you of little faith. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Not, hey, you gave it a good go. Not, let's get you dried off and get a snack and we'll try again later. No. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Can you imagine the look of disappointment on Jesus' face? You of little faith, why did you doubt? The slumped shoulders and the heavy sigh. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Or maybe he used his angry parent voice. The voice you use when your kid decides to do something really stupid. The voice you use when you wake up in the morning and you go downstairs only to discover that she beat you into the kitchen, and she's got an apron on, and she's on a stool, and there's a bowl there filled with milk, and she's got a spoon in her hand, and there are 6 eggs smashed on the floor. And she looks up at you and smiles and says, I'm making pancakes. And you say, why? Whatever made you think this was a good idea? You of little faith. Why did you doubt? Only in that tone of voice that clearly indicates again. Why did you doubt again? Why did you mess up again? You know, I should have guessed this would happen. Maybe you hear Jesus saying it in the voice of your mother or your father from long ago. Again, really? Or maybe you hear Jesus saying it in the voice of that third grade teacher who you could never please. Really, again? Or maybe you hear it in the voice of your first husband, who never tired of telling you that you couldn't get it right. Really, again? When you hear Jesus say it, this reprimand, whose voice do you hear it in? You of little faith, why did you doubt? Really, come on, really, again? Whose voice do you hear? You know whose voice I hear? My own. Roger's voice, of course. That voice of self-recrimination, the one that's really hard for us to shut off. Roger, you didn't have it together again? Roger, you failed again? Again, Roger? Look, these people look to you. They expect you to be big faith. And here you are, really, again, little faith, little faith, little faith. Whose voice do you hear Jesus say, oh, you of little faith? Again? Really? This week I had a little epiphany, a kind of breakthrough and insight. I don't have them very often, but I think it was a breakthrough of grace. I was mulling those two little words over in my mind, little faith, imagining how hard it must have been for Peter to hear Jesus call him that, little faith. And in fact, Jesus called all the disciples that quite often, you of little faith, almost like it's a nickname. In Greek, it's just one word. It doesn't say, you who are of little faith. It just says little faith, like it's their nickname. Like, can you imagine if your shirts were monogrammed LF? Little faith. If you had to wear that around, if that was your nickname, like Jesus is the bully on the school playground making up nicknames for people. Little faith, little faith, little faith. And then I remembered in a flash another verse later on in Matthew. A verse where where Jesus says, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, little faith, the faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll move mountains. Little faith moves mountains. Well, later on in Matthew, when Jesus says that, it comes at the end of a kind of interesting and ambiguous story. Some people bring an epileptic child to the disciples. They ask the disciples to cure the child, but the disciples are unable to do it. So they all bring the child to Jesus, who exclaims in frustration to no one in particular, oh, you faithless generation. And then Jesus heals the child himself. Later on in private, the disciples ask Jesus why they weren't able to heal the child. And Jesus says to them, because of your little faith. And then immediately he says, for truly I tell you, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. First, he tells them they couldn't heal the child because of their little faith. And then he says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, little faith, nothing will be impossible. Then he commends little faith. What's up? Well, here's what I think's going on. I think the disciples are frustrated because they couldn't heal the child. And so they bring the child to Jesus, who can heal the child. They can't heal the child because they have little faith. And that's the way Jesus wants it. That's the way Jesus wants it. Little faith has to look to Jesus to step in. Little faith makes room for Jesus to act. Little faith knows it can't do it on its own, so it has to make room for God to work. In a faithless generation, Jesus is commending the disciples' little faith, the faith that makes room for him to act. Isn't that what's happening with Peter when he steps out on the boat? Peter steps out into the water, but then he gets afraid and he starts to sink. He can't stay afloat on his own, so his little faith looks to Jesus. His little faith cries out to Jesus, save me. His little faith makes room for Jesus to step in. His little faith is an opportunity for God to act. That's not so bad. Now, here's what I think happens next. I'm just making this part up. It's not in the Bible, but I think it's plausible. I think what happens next is this. Peter starts rebuking himself. That little voice, you failed again. You are faithless, Peter. Faithless Peter, he'll never be able to count on you. That little voice in his head starts judging himself. Oh, faithless Peter, you'll never measure up. And so Jesus has to interrupt. Jesus has to interrupt the voice of judgment in Peter's own head with a word of compassion. Hey, little faith, it's okay. It's not a rebuke. It's a tender reminder to Peter of who he is. Hey, Peter, you're one of my little faiths. Remember that. Little faith, your little faith cried out to me and I saved you. That's the way it's supposed to be. Of course you couldn't keep yourself afloat on the water. Of course you got scared. Anyone would. But hey, little faith, you turned to me, didn't you? Little faith, you cried out to me and I saved you, didn't I? That's the way it's supposed to be. Little faith. And then after Jesus interrupts the voice of judgment with a word of gentleness and compassion, then he can ask Peter more objectively, so why did you doubt? Not a question of judgment, not a question of reprimand, but simply an opportunity to look at his life. Peter, why were you afraid? What caused you fear? What distracted you from me? It's a question we little faiths can learn to ask. It's a question Peter can learn to ask. It's a question we can ask about our lives without fear. Once that question is removed from the voice of judgment, why did we doubt? It's okay to ask. You and I, we are Jesus, we are his little faiths in the world. And that's what Jesus needs. Jesus doesn't need heroes who are going to go out and save the world all by themselves. Jesus doesn't need disciples who think they can walk on water. Jesus needs little faiths who turn to him and make room for him to act in their lives and in the world. And Jesus knows the world is scary and unstable and that the waves are going to rise and the wind is going to blow and we're going to get distracted and start to sink. And when we do, he's going to speak to us with gentleness and compassion. With more gentleness and compassion than most of us speak to ourselves. Because he knows this is a chance for us to learn we can't do it on our own. And so what do we little faiths do then? When we can't do it on our own, what do we do then? We cry out, Lord, save me. Of course. Lord, save me. The only one who can. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.